My name is Piper Briggs, and I am 33 years old. For the past 2 years, I have worked as an attending trauma surgeon at one of the busiest emergency departments in East Tennessee. I have opened a patient's chest while their blood pressure was collapsing by the second. I have held a teenager's heart in my hands while my team fought to keep him alive. I have spent countless nights standing under fluorescent lights, covered in blood and exhaustion, knowing that one wrong decision could mean someone never seeing their family again. But somehow, when my own mother introduced me to her church friends, she couldn't bring herself to say I was a surgeon. She called me the babysitter. And a few hours later, when her 5-year-old grandson stopped breathing in Norris Lake, everyone at that party finally learned exactly what I did for a living. The night before my family's lake gathering, I worked a 16-hour shift. We had 3 major trauma cases back to back. First came a highway collision involving multiple vehicles. Then a stabbing victim who arrived barely conscious. After that, a teenage motorcycle rider came in after hitting a guardrail at nearly 70 miles an hour. His injuries were catastrophic. For almost an hour, I worked beside my team trying to control internal bleeding, while the anesthesiologist kept calling out his dangerously low blood pressure. When we finally stabilized him, it was after 2 in the morning. I walked into the call room, sat on the edge of the narrow bed, and slowly peeled off my surgical gloves. My wrists smelled like iodine and antiseptic. My entire body hurt, but I still had notes to finish. Donna, our night charge nurse, stopped by the doorway and looked at me. "Piper, go home." I told her I had one more set of notes. She shook her head and said, "Even the best surgeon in Tennessee needs a bed sometimes." She left a cup of coffee on the counter before walking away. By the time I finished my paperwork, it was cold. I drank it anyway. Then I checked my phone and saw a message from my older brother, Grant. He was hosting a family gathering at his new lake house on Saturday and wanted everyone there. I stared at the invitation for a long time because I already knew what being around my family usually meant. At the hospital, people called me Dr. Briggs. At home, I was simply Piper, the daughter everyone had somehow decided needed less recognition than her brother. I grew up in Maryville, Tennessee, in a family where my father's construction business was treated like a family inheritance. My father, Dale, had spent his life building houses, foundations, and commercial properties. My mother, Lorraine, stayed home, organized church events, ran bake sales, and somehow always knew what everyone else should be doing with their lives. Grant was 4 years older than me, and from the time we were children, everyone assumed he would eventually take over Dad's company. I was the quiet one. I read anatomy books while Grant played football. I studied while he learned how to operate construction equipment. Nobody ever told me I mattered less. They didn't have to. I could feel it in the way every family conversation somehow circled back to Grant. When I received a full scholarship to the University of Tennessee for my pre-med education, I expected my mother to be proud. Instead, she looked worried. She asked how many years I planned to spend in school and when I intended to come home. I told her I was building a future for myself. She simply changed the subject and asked whether Grant had told me about his new truck. That moment taught me something I would spend years learning again and again. My family did not always reject my accomplishments directly. Sometimes they simply acted as though those accomplishments were too insignificant to interrupt a conversation about Grant. During medical school, my mother once told a neighbor that I was helping out at a clinic. I corrected her and explained that I was in medical school. She laughed and told me I knew what she meant. I did know. She had already decided what my place was supposed to be, and facts were never going to be allowed to change it. During residency, I sent my parents a framed copy of my medical degree. Months later, when I visited home, I discovered it still sitting inside the hall closet, wrapped in bubble wrap. On the wall above the couch were Grant's contractor certificates and photographs of him shaking hands with local officials. I asked my mother why my diploma wasn't hanging anywhere. She said she simply hadn't found the right place for it. I pointed toward Grant's certificates and told her there seemed to be plenty of room. She changed the subject to dinner. I invited my parents to my residency completion ceremony. They didn't come. My father said he had a concrete job, and my mother said the drive was too long. I stood in the hospital auditorium while other families filled entire rows. One of my supervisors took a photograph of me because there was nobody from my family there to do it. Then, when I passed my board certification, I called my mother and told her I was officially a board-certified trauma surgeon. She congratulated me for a few seconds before telling me that Grant had just signed a major construction contract. I stopped correcting her after that, not because I believed her, I simply realized that I could spend my entire life explaining who I was, or I could spend that time becoming even better at what I loved. The only person in my family who never seemed confused about me was my nephew Colton. He was 5 years old and had never cared about titles or money or which family member was considered successful. To him, I was simply Aunt Piper. He knew I was a doctor because his father had told him. He liked asking me questions about the hospital, and he loved pretending to diagnose his stuffed animals. 2 days before the lake gathering, he called me and excitedly told me he had learned how to swim. He wanted me to watch him. I had been considering skipping the party, but when I heard his voice, I couldn't say no. I changed my schedule and promised him I would be there. Saturday morning, I drove to Grant's lake house with a small bag packed with clothes, sunscreen, towels, and an emergency kit I always kept in my car. I also brought a child-sized life jacket. When I arrived, the property was crowded. Music played from the porch, people were grilling, and the smell of charcoal filled the humid Tennessee air. My mother stood among several women from her church group. When she saw me, she smiled and waved me over. "Everyone, this is my daughter, Piper. She works up at the hospital." One woman smiled and asked, "Oh, are you a nurse?" I calmly answered, "I'm actually a trauma surgeon." The woman looked surprised. My mother immediately changed the subject. A few minutes later, my sister-in-law Kristen hugged me and said she hadn't expected me to show up because I was always busy with my little hospital job. I smiled and told her trauma surgery was hardly little. She laughed and asked me to help carry a cooler. I carried it without arguing. I wasn't going to spend my nephew's special day fighting over a cooler. Then I found Colton near the dock. He ran toward me, wrapped his arms around my legs, and begged me to watch him swim. I immediately noticed that the dock had no visible life ring. The water became deep only a short distance from the shore. I asked Grant where the safety equipment was. He laughed and said, "Piper, it's a lake, not an operating room." I placed the life jacket where Colton could reach it and stayed close to the water. As more guests arrived, my mother continued her introductions. She praised my father for building the family business. She bragged about Grant's construction company. She complimented Kristen. Then she finally pointed toward me. "And this is Piper. She's our babysitter. She's so good with Colton." The woman smiled at me politely. I looked directly at my mother and said, "I'm not the babysitter, Mom. I'm a trauma surgeon." My mother laughed as if I were being overly serious. Later, Colton asked me why Grandma called me a babysitter. I knelt beside him and told him that sometimes Grandma forgot what I did. He looked genuinely confused. "But you're a doctor," he said. I smiled. "Yes, buddy, I am." Later that afternoon, I sat beside my father and tried one more time to talk about my work. I told him about a 16-year-old motorcycle accident patient whose spleen had ruptured and whose lung had collapsed. I explained how long we had worked to save him. Dad listened for a moment, then started talking about how Grant had poured 40 yards of concrete in a single day. I looked at him and realized that he wasn't trying to insult me. He simply understood the world through things he could touch. Buildings, concrete, walls, foundations. My work happened behind hospital doors, inside human bodies, and under pressure he could barely imagine. But love without understanding could still hurt. After lunch, Dad stood up and gave a speech praising Grant. He talked about hard work and building something with your own hands. Everyone applauded. I stood near the edge of the group holding a glass of water. When he finished, I quietly said, "I build things too, Dad. Mine just happened to be inside people." He looked at me for a moment, then turned back toward the group. That was when I realized I had spent too many years waiting for my family to validate something I already knew was true. Not long afterward, a woman named Darlene sat beside me on the dock. She was one of my mother's church friends. She asked what I actually did at the hospital. I told her I was an attending trauma surgeon. She looked surprised and said my mother had never mentioned that. I told her she would have to ask my mother. Darlene returned to the party and quietly spoke to Lorraine. I could see my mother's expression change. She had finally realized that her version of me was no longer staying inside the family. Then I made a mistake I almost immediately regretted. While going inside to use the bathroom, I noticed a folder on the kitchen counter with my mother's name on it. One of the papers inside had my name visible. I opened it. It was my mother's advance healthcare directive. She had named Grant as the person responsible for her medical decisions. Then I saw a handwritten note saying she didn't want to burden me with those decisions because I had already given enough of my life to the hospital. I read it several times. My first reaction was anger. Then I understood the fear behind it. My mother's own mother had been a midwife who died while coming home from an emergency delivery when Lorraine was still young. My mother had spent decades terrified that medicine would take someone she loved away from her again. But fear did not give her permission to erase me. I put the folder back exactly where I found it and returned outside. I decided I would deal with my mother later, on my own terms. Colton was playing in the shallow water, and I watched him closely. He eventually climbed out, wrapped himself in a towel, and told me proudly that he had reached the orange buoy. Then he looked up at me and said, "Aunt Piper, when I grow up, I want to be a doctor like you." I smiled and told him he could become anything he wanted. Across the yard, I saw Grant watching us. He knew the truth about me. He had always known. He simply hadn't wanted to challenge our parents. By 3 p.m, the adults had become distracted. People were drinking, talking, taking pictures, and enjoying the heat. The children were near the dock. I kept my eyes on Colton. I had already told Grant that the water became dangerously deep beyond the buoy. He told me Colton knew where the shallow area was. I didn't argue. I stayed close enough to see him. Then I heard my mother's voice from the porch. She was talking to another guest about me. "Piper?" She answers phones at the hospital, I think. Or maybe she hands out bandages. I can never remember. I turned toward the porch, stunned by the casual cruelty of it. Then I looked back toward the water. And that's when I saw Colton. He was face down. He wasn't splashing. He wasn't calling for anyone. He was simply floating motionless in the darker water beyond the dock. I didn't think. I moved. I kicked off my shoes and jumped from the dock. The water was cold beneath the warm surface, but I barely noticed. I reached Colton within seconds, turned him onto his back, and pulled his head above water. His lips were blue. His chest wasn't moving. I dragged him back to the dock and hauled him onto the wooden boards. Everything I had learned over years of trauma training took over. I opened his airway and began rescue breathing. His small chest rose beneath my hands. I gave another breath, then began compressions. Around me, people were screaming. Grant was shouting his son's name. Kristen was crying. My father was frozen halfway down the hill. My mother stood with both hands over her mouth. None of it mattered. There was only Colton. I kept going. After several cycles, Colton suddenly coughed. Water came from his mouth. His little body jerked, and I rolled him onto his side. He coughed again, then took a ragged breath. His lips slowly began turning pink. I checked his pulse and felt the rapid but steady beat beneath my fingers. Grant dropped to his knees beside us. His hands were shaking violently. I told him to keep Colton on his side and not put him on his back. Then I told someone to call 911 and report a pediatric drowning. Nobody questioned me. For the first time in my life, my entire family simply followed my instructions. The ambulance arrived about 14 minutes later. The paramedics examined Colton and asked who had performed CPR. I told them I had. When I explained what I had done, the lead paramedic nodded and said, "You're medical." I told him I was a trauma surgeon. He looked at the family and said my response had given Colton the best possible chance. My mother tried to minimize it. She said anyone would have known what to do. The paramedic calmly corrected her. "Ma'am, most bystanders freeze during a pediatric drowning." What she did was trained medical response. Nobody spoke. Colton was transported to the hospital for observation, and I followed behind the ambulance. I arrived wearing damp shorts and a tank top, with my hospital badge buried somewhere inside my bag. My family gathered in the emergency room waiting area. For once, I was sitting on the wrong side of the doors. I knew those chairs. I had seen hundreds of families sit there while waiting for news about someone they loved. A nurse walked past and recognized me. "Dr. Briggs?" I nodded. She looked confused because I wasn't on the schedule. I told her my nephew had been brought in. She nodded and continued down the hallway. Grant stared at me. "Did she just call you doctor?" I looked at him. "That's what everyone at work calls me, Grant." Before he could answer, my mother started explaining the drowning to Darlene. She tried to make it sound as though Grant had somehow been the one who saved Colton. I quietly corrected her. "I got to him, Mom." She said I had helped. I reminded her that the paramedic had specifically said otherwise. She became defensive and said the important thing was that Colton was alive. I agreed. Then I told her that she needed to stop telling people a version of the afternoon where I wasn't the reason he survived. The waiting room went silent. A few minutes later, Grant pulled me into the hallway. His face looked completely different from the man who had been grilling burgers earlier. He apologized for not listening about the life jacket. Then he apologized for something much bigger. He admitted that he had known for years that our parents minimized my career. He said he had stayed silent because it was easier than fighting with them. I told him I didn't need him to feel guilty. I needed him to stop being comfortable with their version of me. He promised he would. Then the emergency room doors opened. My chief, Dr. Rebecca Calloway, walked into the waiting room. She was a tall woman with silver hair and a white coat that always looked perfectly pressed. She was talking to a resident when she suddenly saw me. She stopped. "Dr. Briggs." 2 words. That was all it took. My mother looked up. My father froze. Grant turned around. Kristen stopped scrolling through her phone. Dr. Calloway walked directly toward me and asked why I was sitting in the waiting room. I explained that my nephew was the pediatric drowning case that had just arrived. Her expression immediately changed. "That was your field save?" I nodded. She looked at my family. Then she said, "Piper is one of the strongest trauma surgeons on our team. What she did today was exactly what we train people to do under extreme pressure. She recognized the respiratory arrest, provided immediate ventilation, and continued resuscitation. Until the child responded, my mother's face went pale. Dr. Calloway continued without realizing she was dismantling years of lies. She's also being considered for a leadership position. In our trauma department, my mother opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Then she finally said, "Of course we know she works at the hospital." Dr. Calloway looked confused. "Works at the hospital? She's an attending trauma surgeon." The silence that followed was enormous. Darlene looked directly at my mother. Father stared at the floor. Grant closed his eyes. My mother finally broke. She told me she had been afraid. She told me about her own mother and how she had spent her entire life terrified that medicine would take another person she loved away from hers. She said she thought she was protecting me. I told her the truth. "You weren't protecting me, Mom. You were protecting yourself from having to accept that I chose this life. And I'm good at it." She began crying. My father reached for her hand, then looked at me. "Pip, I should have been there." He admitted he should have attended my ceremonies. He should have celebrated my accomplishments. He should have told people the truth about his daughter. I told him I couldn't change the years we'd already lost. But from now on, I said, when someone asks what your daughter does, tell them the truth. Don't give them your version. Give them mine. Grant nodded from behind him. "I'll make sure they do." Then I looked at my mother. "I love you, Mom, but I won't let you teach Colton that what I do doesn't matter. He already knows who I am." That sentence seemed to hit her harder than anything else. Later that night, Dr. Calloway returned with good news. Colton's oxygen level was normal. His chest x-ray was clear, his lungs sounded good, and there were no immediate signs of serious aspiration. He would stay overnight for observation, but she expected him to make a full recovery. When I entered his room, Colton was lying beneath a white hospital blanket with a small oxygen tube under his nose. He opened his eyes when he saw me. Aunt Piper, I sat beside him. He smiled sleepily and asked if I had been the one who helped him. "Breathe." I told him I had. He smiled again. "I knew you could do it." "You're a doctor." I kissed his forehead. "Go to sleep." "Buddy." He closed his eyes. I sat there for another minute, listening to his steady breathing. When I looked toward the doorway, my mother was standing there. There was no audience, no church friends, no family gathering, no story she needed to control. Just a mother looking at her daughter. We didn't say anything. For once, we didn't need to. The following week brought several changes. Grant called me and told me he had framed my medical school diploma and board certification. He had hung them in his office beside his contractor's license. He told me, "I should have done this years ago." I answered honestly, "Yes, you should have." My father left me a voicemail. It was almost 2 minutes long, and most of it was silence. I could hear him struggling to find the right words. Finally, his voice cracked. "I'm sorry I never came to your ceremonies, Pip. I told myself you didn't need me there. I was wrong." It was the most honest thing he had said to me in years. Kristen also apologized for the daycare comment, told her it had been hurtful. She admitted it had been wrong. My mother took longer. She didn't call me immediately, but the following Sunday, Darlene told me something that surprised me. At church, someone asked Lorraine about her children. My mother didn't hesitate. She said, "My son runs the family construction company, and my daughter is a trauma surgeon at UT Medical Center. Nothing more, no joke, no explanation, no attempt to make my career sound smaller, just the truth. And strangely enough, that was when I realized something. I hadn't won because my chief walked into that waiting room. I hadn't won because my family finally admitted I was a surgeon. I had already won years earlier. I won the first night I stood in an operating room with a scalpel in my hand and realized I was exactly where I belonged. The lake didn't make me valuable. Saving Colton didn't make me important. My family's approval didn't create my worth. It simply took one terrifying afternoon for everyone else to finally see what I had known about myself all along. I was Piper Briggs, I was a daughter, I was an aunt, and I was a trauma surgeon for 10 years. My family had tried to make me smaller because that version of me was easier for them to understand. But the little boy I saved never saw me as small. He never called me a babysitter. He never questioned my accomplishments. He simply looked at me and knew exactly who I was. And sometimes, the person who sees your worth most clearly is the one you least expect. Used to think revenge meant making people regret what they had done to me. Now I know better. Sometimes the strongest revenge is simply becoming so undeniable that the people who tried to erase you have no choice but to tell the truth.